Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're diving into something that's been on all of our minds lately. Information manipulation, specifically how it played out during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're basing this deep dive on an article from Collateral Insanity content.
Okay.
And let me tell you, it's a real eye-opener. You know, we've all seen those wild theories and conflicting information flying around back then.
Right.
It felt like everyone had a different version of the truth.
Yeah.
But this article goes beyond just the surface chaos and asks, was this deliberate? Were those in power pulling the strings?
What's fascinating about this article is how it connects the dots between seemingly isolated events and reveals a bigger picture. It argues that the pandemic wasn't just a public health crisis, it was a crisis of the system itself.
Okay.
And when systems fail, those in power often resort to manipulation to protect their interests.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Yeah.
I remember early on there was that video of people in China eating bat soup that went viral. Everyone was freaking out, blaming it for the pandemic.
Right.
Turns out that video was from years before COVID. It wasn't even representative of Chinese cuisine.
Exactly, and that's a prime example of how easily we can be misled. The article argues that this kind of misinformation isn't random. It's often deliberately spread to create scapegoats and distract from the real issues.
So it's not just about spreading lies, it's about controlling the narrative. But who benefits from that?
Well, the article argues that it's those who benefit from the current system, the so-called elites. They need us, the public, to buy into their story to maintain their control. When things go wrong, like they did during the pandemic, they need to shift the blame away from themselves and the system they uphold.
Makes sense. If they can convince us that it's someone else's fault,
Right.
or that some crazy conspiracy is to blame,
Right.
then we're less likely to look at the bigger picture and demand real change.
Precisely. The article points to Donald Trump's response to the pandemic as a clear example of this. At first, he downplayed the virus, even praising China's response. Then when things started spiraling in the US, he abruptly shifted gears, calling it a Chinese bioweapon.
It's interesting how that rhetoric really took hold. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the China virus, and the focus shifted away from the Trump administration's own missteps.
That's the power of scapegoating. It allows those in power to deflect responsibility and control the narrative instead of focusing on the lack of preparedness, the shortage of PPE, or the systemic issues within the U.S. healthcare system. The conversation became about blaming China.
And it wasn't just China, right? Remember all those conspiracy theories that popped up? Like the one about 5G causing COVID? People were actually attacking cell towers.
Right.
I mean, it sounds ridiculous now.
Yeah.
But at the time, people were scared and looking for answers.
Absolutely. And that's where the article's analysis of manufactured consent gets really interesting. It argues that these kinds of narratives thrive on fear and uncertainty. When people are anxious, they're more likely to latch onto any explanation, even if it's completely unfounded.
So the more chaotic and confusing the situation, the easier it is to manipulate people.
Exactly. And the article highlights how this manipulation isn't always about outright lies. Sometimes it's about using seemingly well-intentioned arguments to obscure the real issues.
Okay, I'm curious. How does that work? Give me an example.
The article uses the example of David Quammen, a respected science writer who wrote a book connecting COVID to environmental destruction. Now, that connection is valid, right? Destroying natural habitats increases the risk of zoonotic diseases like COVID.
Right, that makes sense. But what's manipulative about that?
The article points out that Quammen's argument, while accurate, focuses blame on humanity as a whole. It creates a sense of collective guilt, saying we're all responsible, but it fails to pinpoint the real culprits, the corporations and systems that prioritize profit over the planet.
I see what you mean. It's like saying we're all in this together, but ignoring the fact that some of us are in first class and others are stuck in steerage.
Exactly. That's how the elites maintain their power. They convince us we're all equally responsible for problems that they created, deflecting blame and preventing us from demanding real systemic change.
Wow, this is really making me think differently about how information is used and manipulated. So we've seen how those in power used scapegoating and even seemingly well-intentioned arguments to control the narrative during the pandemic. But what about the vaccine rollout? Wasn't that supposed to be the solution?
Well, the article argues that even the vaccine rollout became a tool for reinforcing existing power structures. Remember, it argues that the entire system was built on this fragile, just-in-time model.
Like no reserves, no backup plan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when the pandemic hit, the establishment was caught off guard. The mRNA vaccine was hastily deployed, and the way it was rolled out felt less like a collective effort to protect public health and more like a top-down imposition.
Yeah, I remember there was a lot of pressure to get vaccinated. Mandates, restrictions, it felt very divisive.
And the article argues that this approach deepened the sense of unease and mistrust towards institutions. Instead of fostering a sense of unity and collective responsibility, it further polarized the public.
So even with the vaccine, the opportunity for genuine collective action was missed.
Precisely. And the article argues that this wasn't just incompetence. It was a continuation of the same manipulative tactics we saw throughout the pandemic. By creating a sense of fear and urgency, those in power could justify further restrictions and control.
It's kind of unsettling to think that even a public health crisis, like a pandemic, could be used to reinforce existing power structures. I mean, shouldn't the focus have been on saving lives and protecting people?
Ideally, yes. But the article makes a compelling argument that the pandemic exposed the inherent flaws and inequalities in our current system. And when those flaws were exposed, those in power didn't step up to fix them. Instead, they doubled down on the same tactics they've always used: control, manipulation, and division.
You know, this whole conversation is making me feel a bit overwhelmed. It's like everywhere you look, there's some kind of manipulation going on. It's hard to know what to believe or who to trust.
I understand that feeling. The article actually talks about how that feeling of overwhelm is itself a tactic used by those in power. They want us to feel exhausted, confused, and powerless. Because when we're overwhelmed, we're less likely to question things or fight back.
So what can we do about it? How do we even begin to untangle this web of manipulation and reclaim our sense of agency?
The article offers some practical strategies for resisting manipulation. First, it emphasizes the importance of critical thinking. We can't just passively consume information anymore. We need to actively question everything we see and hear, especially when it comes from sources that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we become more critical thinkers? Especially when we're already feeling bombarded with information from all sides.
One key step is to be aware of our own biases. We all have preconceived notions about the world. Based on our experiences, value, and beliefs, it's important to acknowledge those biases and recognize how they might be influencing the way we interpret information.
That makes sense. If we're not aware of our own biases, we're more likely to fall prey to information that confirms what we already believe, even if it's not true.
Exactly. Another important strategy is to diversify our sources of information. Don't just rely on one news outlet or social media platform. Seek out perspectives from different sides of the spectrum, even those that challenge your own views.
So break out of our echo chambers and expose ourselves to different ideas. That's definitely something I need to work on.
It's a challenge for all of us in today's media landscape, but it's crucial if we want to develop a more nuanced and informed understanding of the world. And when you're evaluating information, ask yourself some key questions. Who's the source? What's their agenda? What evidence do they present to support their claims? And most importantly, who benefits from you believing this information?
Those are great questions to keep in mind. It's like a checklist for spotting potential manipulation. But what about the emotional side of things? You mentioned earlier that those in power often use fear and anger to manipulate us. How do we deal with that?
That's a crucial point. Manipulators are masters at playing on our emotions. They know that when we're feeling scared, angry, or outraged, we're less likely to think critically. So it's important to be aware of those emotional responses and to pause before reacting. Take a step back, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, is this information actually true, or am I just reacting emotionally?
So don't let your emotions be hijacked by manipulative content. Take a moment to check in with yourself.
Yeah.
And assess the situation rationally.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to feel uncertain or confused. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know, or I need more information. It's better to admit you don't have all the answers than to blindly accept information that might be false or misleading.
You know, what strikes me is that a lot of this boils down to trust. We used to trust institutions like the government, the media, and even scientists to provide us with accurate information. But that trust has been eroded, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And the article argues that this erosion of trust is part of the larger strategy of those in power. They want us to be distrustful of everyone and everything except for them, because when we don't trust anyone, we're more likely to turn to them for answers, even if those answers are manipulative or self-serving.
It's like they're creating a vacuum of trust and then filling it with their own narrative.
Yeah.
But if we can't trust them, then who can we trust? How do we even begin to rebuild that trust?
That's a complex question, and there's no easy answer. But the article suggests that one way to start rebuilding trust is to focus on building relationships within our own communities.
So instead of looking to institutions or those in power for guidance, we should be looking to each other.
Exactly. When we connect with people on a personal level, we're more likely to see past the divisive narratives and recognize our shared humanity. We can start having honest conversations about the issues that matter to us and build solidarity based on mutual understanding and respect.
That makes sense. If we can foster a sense of community and trust at the local level, maybe we can start to challenge the manipulative narratives that are being imposed on us from above.
The article also points to the importance of supporting alternative media sources and organizations that are committed to truth-telling and holding power to account.
So instead of just consuming mainstream media, which is often beholden to corporate interests, we should be actively seeking out independent voices and perspectives.
Exactly. These alternative sources may not have the same reach or resources as the mainstream media, but they often provide a more nuanced and critical analysis of events. By supporting these sources, we can help to create a more diverse and democratic media landscape.
You know, it's interesting how we keep circling back to this idea of democracy. It seems like the manipulation we're talking about is fundamentally an attack on democracy itself.
That's a profound observation. The article argues that democracy thrives on informed and engaged citizens who are able to think critically and hold their leaders accountable. But when information is manipulated and trust is eroded, the very foundations of democracy are weakened.
So resisting manipulation isn't just about protecting ourselves from misinformation. It's about defending our democratic values. It's about fighting for a society where truth matters and where power is held accountable.
Absolutely. And that fight starts with each of us. It starts with questioning everything, thinking critically, and demanding better from our leaders and institutions.
And it starts with connecting with each other, building community, and supporting those who are speaking truth to power.
Exactly. It's a challenging task, but it's one that's worth fighting for, because the future of our democracy and perhaps even our planet depends on it.
You know, it's easy to feel discouraged when we see how deeply ingrained these manipulative tactics are in our society. But this article also emphasizes the importance of not giving up hope.
Absolutely. The article reminds us that the system, as it describes, relies on our consent. They need us to buy into their narratives, to accept the status quo even when it's working against our best interests.
So if we withdraw that consent, if enough of us start to question the narratives and demand something different, that's where the real power lies.
Precisely. The article argues that true change comes from collective action, from people coming together to demand a more just and equitable world.
That brings me back to something you mentioned earlier about the impact of the pandemic on the working class. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
The article highlights how the pandemic and the response to it exacerbated existing inequalities. Lockdowns and restrictions disproportionately affected small businesses and working families. We were the ones forced to choose between our health and our livelihoods, while those at the top continued to profit.
It's like the pandemic became a magnifying glass, exposing all the cracks in the system that were already there.
Exactly. And the article argues that this was no accident. It points to the policies that prioritized corporate bailouts over direct aid to individuals, the lack of support for essential workers, and the way the vaccine rollout was handled, which often felt more coercive than collaborative.
It's frustrating to see how the burden of the pandemic fell so heavily on those who could least afford it.
The article argues that this is a pattern we see time and time again. Those in power protect their own interests while the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves.
So how do we break this cycle? It can feel so overwhelming, like we're up against a system that's rigged against us.
The article offers some hope here. It argues that the very fact that these manipulative tactics are being used so blatantly is a sign that the system is feeling threatened. They wouldn't need to resort to these measures if they weren't worried about losing their grip on power.
So their desperation is a sign of our potential strength.
Exactly. It means that our voices are starting to be heard, that we're starting to see through the illusions, but it also means we need to be even more vigilant, even more committed to exposing the truth and demanding something better.
This has been such an insightful conversation, and I have to admit it's a bit of a wake-up call. I feel like I have a better understanding of the forces at play, but also a greater sense of urgency to do something about it.
I think that's a common reaction. The article doesn't sugarcoat the challenges we face, but it also offers a path forward, one that emphasizes critical thinking, collective action, and a refusal to accept the status quo.
I'm curious, what are some concrete steps we can take to resist these manipulative tactics and create a more just and equitable world?
The article emphasizes the importance of supporting organizations and movements that are working to challenge the system. These could be groups focused on economic justice, environmental protection, healthcare reform, or any other issue that resonates with you. Donating your time or money to these causes can make a real difference.
So putting our money where our mouth is and supporting those who are on the front lines of change.
Exactly. Another important step is to get involved in your local community. Attend town hall meetings, volunteer for local initiatives, connect with your neighbors. Building strong communities is essential for resisting the divisive tactics that those in power rely on.
So finding strength in numbers and creating a network of support.
Precisely.
Oh.
And perhaps most importantly, never stop questioning, never stop learning, and never stop speaking out. The more informed and engaged we are, the less effective these manipulative tactics will be.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, and I hope it's inspired our listeners to take action. Remember, those in power rely on our silence and complacency. When we start questioning, challenging, and demanding something better, that's when real change happens.
We all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world. It starts with recognizing the manipulative tactics that are being used against us, and then taking steps to resist them.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of information manipulation. We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand how these tactics work, the better equipped we'll be to fight back.
Be sure to check out the full article on www.collateral.insanity.com for even more insights and analysis.
And until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to get you thinking. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.